time for our news review. We begin with the Telegraph and a warning from the United States that North Korea faces a massive military response that would be overwhelming if Pyongyang threatens America or its allies.
In the meantime, the Philippine Daily Inquirer is looking at the rising tension in the region and a warning coming from Russian President Vladimir Putin, who said the standoff between North Korea and the US is close to spilling into a large-scale conflict. The Russian president added it was a mistake to pressurise Pyongyang into halting its nuclear missile programme.
Well, the Arab News says Muslim anger is growing in Asia as violence continues against Myanmar's Rohingya Muslim refugees. The paper also reports Rohingya communications spokesperson Salah Abdulshakur al-Arakani has criticised Myanmar's state councillor Aung San Suu Kyi as being a partner in crime with the army against Rohingya Muslims in Rakhine State.
Gulf News business section. China has called on the BRICS, that's of course Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, the group of emerging economies, to promote global free trade. At the start of a three-day summit in southeastern China, Beijing has sought to position itself against an America First agenda.
And The Guardian reports on the ongoing Brexit negotiations and comments made by the European Union's chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, who said the British people need to be taught a lesson about the consequences of leaving the EU single market.
And finally, financial pages in The Guardian look at global asset managers Schroders, who are predicting more than $1.5 trillion in company profits worldwide could be erased by taxes required to meet the Paris Climate Change Agreement.
So let's start now and take a look at some of those stories in more detail. With us this morning is Oliver Cornock, who's Editor-in-Chief of the Oxford Business Group. Welcome to you.
Morning.
So we've got the Daily Telegraph's front page on a lot of international papers, of course, reaction to North Korea yesterday testing its furthest and most powerful nuclear missile to date, and a fairly overwhelmingly strong response from the international community, not least President Trump.
Absolutely, and the question on everybody's tongues is what to do, and equally is the statement something must be done, which is always dangerous because quite simply, it's very clear none of the options available are particularly attractive, and none of them are very obvious either. So we're left in this situation where world leaders are trying, on one level, to de-escalate, and then on another level, we've got the rhetoric coming out of the US, perhaps predictably from Donald Trump, a fairly belligerent ratcheting up, it seems. And the question is, where will this all end up? It's obviously rattled markets, as we've seen. It's not good for the economies of South Korea, and certainly any options that increase, for example, sanctions against North Korea are very unattractive to China. Remember, right on that border, a huge refugee crisis, for example, would destabilise the region again. But the question is, what would happen if nothing's done? So when we move on to the next story, when we see President Putin saying exerting pressure on on North Korea is not an option, well, you're left asking, what would you do then?
Well, I was just going to say that, actually, because, you know, his comments don't pressurise them with further or broader sanctions. So what are the options? That's the question. And many are looking not necessarily to Russia, but certainly to China to play its part in this whole situation. And in terms of the response from China so far, what have we got?
It does seem to me that China perhaps holds certainly some of the keys to unlocking this problem. They can exert pressure in a way that nobody else has. They have better relations, although, of course, famously, President Xi has been sort of outed recently as not being a great fan of the North Korean leader.
And neither is he. The relationship goes vice versa as well, doesn't it?
Exactly, but historically, of course, they've had a much stronger relationship than perhaps anybody else in the world. So, in terms of exerting pressure through cutting off oil supplies, perhaps that might be. Apparently, North Korea's down to the last 6 months of oil supplies now. Could that be the answer? Who knows? The simple fact is that probably a combination of increased sanctions, perhaps when the UN meets later today, increased pressure from China, and a sort of a global coalition trying to push pressure. But certainly that needs to continue, because what else can be? Well,
North Korea, what they want, what Kim Jong-un wants, is to be kind of brought in from the cold, to be given international recognition. And given this huge war of words that we've seen escalating over the past weeks and months, you just can't see that being on the table at the moment, can you?
And I couldn't agree with you more. If that's what he wants, to come in from the cold, you have to ask whether we want somebody in from the cold who's prepared to push himself onto the global stage in this way.
Okay.
Right, let's move on. And this is a story that we don't necessarily talk about that often in this paper review. But the Arab News have got its, firm and centre on its front page. Suu Kyi, partner in crime against the Rohingya. This is a minority group, and it's very, very controversial, isn't it? Aung San Suu Kyi, since she's, come out of house arrest and come into politics, how this group is being treated.
Absolutely, Stanley. And of course, it's not the first time that Aung San Suu Kyi has been implicated in this story of discrimination against this minority Muslim population within Myanmar. Interesting that this story is carried in the Arab News, which is a Saudi Arabian paper, again, a Sunni Muslim country predominantly. And this story is about the response, really, to this discrimination against this minority in Indonesia, the world's largest, the most populous Islamic state in the world. And points this finger firmly at this minority being attacked by the army, and there's apparently this passive endorsement, from the alleged passive endorsement from this Nobel laureate, and the Saudi paper and the president of Indonesia, Widodo, are criticising her.
Let's move on to the Gulf News business pages now, and this story with President Xi Jinping opening the BRICS conference yesterday in Southeast China. A big moment for him, somewhat overshadowed by that development in North Korea. But nevertheless, he made his big speech, and his plea is for free markets, very much the anti-Trump agenda when it comes to what's happening in the markets at the moment.
There's a certain irony here that China, a huge market, one of the core BRIC economies, is calling, with some questionable practices and a fairly closed economy, is calling for greater openness in counter to this America First policy. Also, we must remember that the BRICS are meeting, these four big countries, are meeting at a time when those commodity-led economies of the emerging markets are really suffering. We see that at Oxford Business Group at the moment, a lot of these markets dominate the regions in which they are, which they're based, and they're all suffering. So there's a lot to be talked about here. This idea of expanding the BRICS group as well. Mexico would like to do that, and of course be extremely timely with what's going on in America, north of Mexico, for them to be brought into this group. The question, though, has to come down to, have they got enough clout as a body at the moment to start pushing themselves forward? There's some political wrangling between India and China. We saw over the Himalayas recently.
And there's a lot of internal political wrangling in South Africa. I mean,
huge problems within Egypt and Brazil, huge
not
systemic problems within these economies.
As strong as they used to be.
Exactly.
That's for sure.
So you have to question their existence. They do exist, but how much power do they have and how much unity can they garner?
Now, what do you make of Michel Barnier's comments that British people need to be taught a lesson about the consequences of leaving the single market? I would say that many British people would say every day they're being reminded of the consequences by us in the media, if no one else.
Absolutely. And furthermore, the tone of this comment from Michel Barnier, meeting on the banks of Lake Como in a five-star hotel, sadly enforces so many of the stereotypes that British people have about the European Union. So whether you agree with this or not, the language is really strange.
It's very antagonistic,
very antagonistic, not constructive, and so it's left now to seem to me to sort of again fuel this tit for tat, rather negative, not very constructive presentation of the debate. A negotiation is going to be negative now and again, but it does seem to me that this language is not very helpful.
What are people saying to you about Brexit? I mean, obviously at the Oxford Business Group, you're talking to business leaders all the time. What's their feeling about how it's going?
Well, we speak to emerging markets around the world, probably frontier markets if you're a banker. So economies that are looking to open their borders, and there is actually staggering disbelief that an economy the scale of the UK would choose, as they would perceive it in very simplistic terms, to step back from a very open and free trade deal.
Of course, there's many months to go on this, and the mood music is terribly negative, especially when we see things like this. Do you think that they need to change their attitudes very briefly to move things forward positively?
I have to, and let's just look at this headline. I mean, this language alone is not going to be helpful.
OK. Oliver Cornock,
thanks for coming in. Nice to see you.
Thanks very much. Lovely to see you. Stay with us here on BBC World News. All the top stories coming up next.
Bye-bye. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Now, the Russian authorities say that this anti-corruption protest is illegal. but people have come onto the streets anyway.
The army has been deployed at sensitive locations around the country as part of a 3-month state of emergency.
They've come from the marshes and the swamps where they've been hiding from the fighting and where there's no food.
Over there, it's the Iraqi flag that's flying on the airfield again. This is a landmark moment.
Away from that here, we've just seen confused people who are numb, who can't quite believe what they have seen tonight.
We break stories from more places than any other international news broadcaster. We are the leaders in global breaking news.